Connecting to SaaS applications. Anypoint Studio and the Exchange offer us a lot of different connectors that we can use for handling SaaS apps. SaaS connectors are operation-based endpoints for interacting with third-party APIs. Many of these are bundled with Anypoint Studio, and additional SaaS connectors can be found in the Anypoint Exchange. The Salesforce connector is what we'll be looking at, and this is a secure way to access and act upon Salesforce.com, and it eliminates the need to custom code and secure a connection with Salesforce. This connector handles all 5 of the integration patterns for connecting with Salesforce. It can perform operations that Salesforce exposes via its 4 APIs. It does not expose all possible operations, but it will expose quite a bit of them. Walk through 11.1. Connect to a SaaS application, Salesforce. First, we'll start by browsing Salesforce data on http salesforce.com. We'll use the Salesforce connector to retrieve accounts for a postal code, and we'll use the query builder to write a query. Let's get started. In the web browser, let's start by visiting login.salesforce.com. Take a moment now to pause the video and log into salesforce.com using the credentials you set up in our first video. Logged in, we'll click the Accounts tab in the top, and in the View drop-down menu, we'll select All Accounts and hit Go. All right. Now, once you've done this, you should see some sample accounts that Salesforce has in by default. You'll see a bunch of extra sample data that I have in mind from playing around, but again, you'll likely see some different accounts inside of here as you look through your result set. Notice from here that countries and postal codes are not displayed by default. Let's see if we can set up a view so we can display both of these, as they'll be quite relevant to us. Let's click the Create New View link next to the drop-down menu displaying all accounts. Let's set the name to the view to All Accounts with postal code. And now we'll specify some criteria inside of here. Scrolling down, we'll look inside the Select fields to display. Inside of here, let's include the billing zip and postal code, and also the billing country. We'll add those over to our selected fields, and if you'd prefer, you can move these up a little bit higher below account names so that they're easier to access. We'll then go to the bottom and hit the Save button. Now return to Anypoint Studio, and inside Anypoint Studio, let's open up the APDevs-examples project. So for now, I will collapse APDev Flights WS, and right-click on the APDev examples and open this project. I'll also temporarily close the APDev Flights WS to make sure I don't get them mixed up. In APDev examples, we'll open up source main app, and we'll open up the accounts.xml. With accounts.xml open, we'll select our HTTP listener at the start of this flow. And remember that this is an HTTP listener we were using for testing earlier, where it's exposed on /SFDC. Now, let's go ahead and drag out a Salesforce connector and drag that between the HTTP endpoint and the logger. With the Salesforce connector dropped in, we'll look inside of our Package Explorer on the left, and we'll now notice that the Salesforce libraries have been added automatically. This is something Studio will take care of for us. And if we were using a tool like Maven to handle our builds, it would get added to the POM file in Maven as well. Now, let's go to Source Main App. And inside of Source Main App, let's look inside of our mule-app.properties. Inside of mule-app.properties, let's set an environment variable that we're going to use later, which is setting our environment to dev. You might recall we used this to resolve a property placeholder a little bit earlier in class. Inside of Source Main Resources, let's now go in and right-click, go to New, and let's create a new file inside of here. This new file is going to be called examples-dev.properties. And after you've clicked Finish inside of here, let's put in a username, password, and security token. So I'm going to put in sfdc.username, sfdc.password, sfdc.token. And inside of here, we are going to add in our SFDC username, password, and token. This was also something we showed you how to get in one of the introductory videos around setting up your environment. So take a moment now to go and get your SFDC username, password, and token per those instructions and place them inside of here. Once you've done that, come back to this video and let's continue on. Once you've saved those examples-dev.properties, let's go into the global XML and get ourselves set up for Salesforce. Inside of global XML, we'll head to global elements and we'll click create. Now, to get ourselves set up, we'll need to be able to resolve these properties. So inside of here, let's look for another property placeholder as we had done earlier in class. We'll hit OK for the property placeholder and we'll set up the location. The location will be examples dash, and we'll use the property dev, or env rather, dot properties. Recall that this is going to be resolved from that env that we had set to dev, which will then resolve to our property file right down here, allowing us to switch contextually based on environment. Let's now hit OK, and now we've got our property placeholder created. Now we'll also hit create again, and this time let's set up our Salesforce connector. So the Salesforce connector type we are going to use among the different authentication mechanisms is going to be Salesforce Basic Authentication. Let's select that and hit OK. Now, inside of Salesforce Basic Authentication, let's set ourselves up with a username, password, and token. The username we can get right from our properties, which is sfdc.username. Our token can be gathered as well, which will be, or password in this case, sfdc.password. And then our security token can be resolved as well with sfdc.token. You can keep all of the other settings as is, test your connection by hitting validate configuration, and assuming that the credentials can be picked up and resolved correctly, we should see that the test was connected successfully. If this looks good to you, you can hit OK and hit OK again. All right. Now we should be set up to configure our endpoint. We'll save all of our files so far, and we'll go back to that accounts XML where we put in our Salesforce connector. From here, we can see the connector configuration has been chosen. This is what we had just created a moment ago. And now let's select an operation. You can see all the different operations inside of here. And again, these are what we talked about, us abstracting the API and allowing you to just focus on what you want to get done. In this case, let's set up a query operation. The query operation is going to allow us to use DataSense query language to build out a query into Salesforce. This is going to allow us to select different records. Now, rather than having to guess what all the different fields are, we can also choose the query builder, which is going to be able to introspect Salesforce and figure out what our objects are, and then eventually what those fields are as well. Let's select account inside of here, and once account has introspected all of its fields, in the right here we're going to see the different fields that comply with it. Let's select billing city, billing country, we'll do billing postal code, state and street. And on top of that, scroll down a little bit lower and let's also select the name. So now we're going to select these objects, and these are the relevant fields that we will capture when we bring that object into Mule. Let's hit OK. And now you'll also see that the query builder has set up the actual DataSense query language query to attract or bring in these objects. Let's begin by running our application in debug mode. We'll do this by toggling a breakpoint on top of the Salesforce connector and then running the project in debug. Once the project starts up, we're going to make a sample request through Postman and see exactly what's coming through to this endpoint. We'll keep an eye on the console and make sure that it deploys successfully. Go back to the debugger tab and then head to Postman. Once you've got Postman open, you'll want to make a GET request to localhost 8081, specifically to the SFDC endpoint. With this in place, we'll hit send. And once we've sent it in, we'll return to Anypoint Studio and see exactly what's going on. Now at the point that we're on Salesforce, of course the payload is null because we haven't actually triggered Salesforce. Let's step forward on top of the logger, and once we've done that, you can select your payload and see that it is a consumer iterator. So it's actually an iterator that we can bring different records in as we go. So what this means is, if we go into our expression evaluator, we can type in an expression like payload.next using the iterator API. And when we hit enter on next, you'll see it gives us an object which contains one of the Salesforce objects. And remember, your object data is likely to be different than mine, but for the time being, each time you hit enter on next, it'll take a moment and it will go out and grab a chunk of records which you'll then start iterating through. You can see the result sets changing. Each time I hit enter on next, another object comes in. All right, this is good perspective for some of the things that we're going to do. For now, we'll click back into the canvas and we'll stop the application. I'll also return to Mule Design mode for the moment. Now, let's see if we can transform this data that's going to be coming out of Salesforce. So let's add a transform message component right before the logger. With transform message in place, we're going to start writing a transformation. We'll start off by setting the transformation itself to be payload, and the output type in this case to be JSON, to see if we can serialize or transform the result set coming in as an iterator into a JSON payload. Now, with this in place, we'll save the application and we'll run it in normal mode again. Once this starts up, we're going to head back to Postman and make the same request we had made previously, but this time see if we actually get a valid response back to our client. Once it's started up, we'll head back to Postman, send the request in again. And mine might take some significant time, especially considering the amount of records that I've currently got in Salesforce. I probably should have cleaned some of them out. But nonetheless, if I look through my JSON result set, I can see it took all of those Salesforce records and turned them into JSON format. What an easy way to expose my Salesforce data as a simple endpoint that I can access. And you'll see all these different records that it eventually transformed into a JSON format. All right. Now that we've got that data back, let's return to Anypoint Studio, and let's double click on Salesforce and modify the query a bit to make it a bit more selective. What we'll do inside of here is we'll go down into our query area and choose the query builder again. In the query builder, I now want to put in some type of filter criteria. We can do this by hitting Add Filter, and in the dropdown we can choose a field, again introspected from our object. The field that we are going to use will be billing postal code, and we are going to look for billing postal codes that are equal to a postal code that we would like to test for. So what I'll have you do here is put in a postal code that you're aware of, maybe one that you live at or is local to your area that you know of. So in my case, I'm going to put in 80305. And again, you can choose your own unique postal code here, and I recommend you do. And then we'll hit OK. So now we're filtering criteria to only that postal code. We'll examine the generated query and see that that has now been included as well. Let's now test the application inside of here. We'll save, and once it restarts, all right. Now, if we go into Postman and send this request in again, our result set should look quite different. In my case, it's completely empty. You might have gotten lucky and chose a postal code that the example data already had, or you might be like me and not have a result set inside of here. So for those of us who don't have a result set, let's go ahead and add one in and make sure it shows up when we query it again. Back in Salesforce, we can add a new account in using the New Account button. In this case, just make an account up. So I'll call this the Riverboat Company. And the Riverboat Company will have a city, a state, and a zip code. And again, I recommend that you put in your own unique zip code and so on that's going to match what you're looking for. Some fake information about the billing. So in this case, it will be, all right. Now with the sample data in place, let's save this account so that it is now created. We can now see the Riverboat Company is part of Salesforce. And when heading back to Postman and making the query again, we can now see that the Riverboat Company is coming through based on how our query is set up inside of Mule. All right, great. Once you've got your own sample data coming through, we'll return back to Anypoint Studio. And for now, let's stop the project and we'll head back to the slides and talk a little bit about communicating with files.